Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by University of Manitoba Extended Education. My name is Yvonne Kinley and I am your moderator. Today we're delving into the topic Changing Behaviors, Changing Hearts and Minds, Intentional EDIA Strategy in Turbulent Times. Now to introduce our speaker for today. Robin Atlas is a white settler based in Treaty 1 territory with a lifelong passion for equity, justice, and social responsibility through education. Her pronouns are she, her. She works at the University of Manitoba as an EDIA specialist in the Division of Extended Education, the latest step in a long career supporting others to integrate equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, along with decolonization and reconciliation into educational practice in universities in Canada and the US. In her present role, Robin oversees and teaches EDIA programming for university staff, students, and faculty, and consults with the division on other EDIA initiatives. In addition to this work, Robin facilitates workshops and discussions on a range of EDIA topics for both academic and non-academic audiences, including school and government officials and community groups. She maintains an active research agenda focused on strategies to support learners through their journey in EDIA and truth and reconciliation. Outside of work, Robin enjoys homesteading and volunteering with her family near St. Genevieve, Manitoba. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And now I'd like to pass it over to Robin to start today's session.
Thanks, Yvonne, and welcome everyone. Just a note, if you'd like to turn on captioning, you do have that option, I believe, at the bottom of your screen, so just know that's available to you. We've planned for an hour-long session, and I've broken it up into a few different shorter chunks, thinking about first, what's the difference between changing hearts and minds and changing behaviors, and then talking about strategies for each one. From there, I will touch briefly on what it means to do this kind of work in turbulent times, and from there, shift towards a bit more of a focused discussion about what Extended Education is doing in this regard, and then move to questions. I'd also invite you, if you have something nearby to take notes, whether that's a separate document on your screen or a piece of paper, there will be a few moments where you'll have time to reflect on your own experiences. And I do find that writing can often help to stay focused in a webinar setting like this, where I'm going to be doing a lot of talking. So that is there too. Okay, so to start the conversation, there's a picture now being displayed that shows a garden with both flowers and vegetable plants. And I will describe this image shortly, but I wanted to first tell you a story about my experience in a workshop that I attended around equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace. The facilitators gave a session, and it was really well planned, thoughtful, lots of engagement, good information, but I also felt it was somewhat superficial. And then in conversation with them afterwards, I was asking them about their approach and why they chose not to talk about values or the reasons that we're doing this or the major shifts to society that we need to address and why organizations need to get on with this and all these sorts of big questions. And their response to me was, well, that's important, but we don't want to change hearts and minds right now. We want to change behaviors. And that really got me thinking about the different types of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility initiatives, and therefore strategies that an individual or an organization might adopt. And I want to be clear, this is not a situation where one is better than the other. It's not an either or a versus sort of a thing. They're both really necessary and can lead to important change relating to these topics. But I think it's important also to be intentional. What do you want to do? Why do you want to do it? And then what strategies you'll use as a result. So before I get into more details on those differences, I did promise to explain the picture, but I want you to start with a bit of a reflection. So thinking about changing behaviors and changing hearts and minds, which type of change speaks to you more? Which one reflects the work that you or your organization tend to do? So write down your thoughts if you can. And I'm also recognizing we're all coming from different roles, different places, different positions in society. We have different experiences and understandings, and that's okay. So reflecting in the way that makes sense to you is totally fine. But we also want to recognize that this work is everyone's responsibility, and yet the way we approach the work will change depending on our role, our identities, our lived experiences. So bring that into your reflections as well. I'll give you a few moments in silence, and then we'll move on. All right, some of you might still be thinking, some might have wrapped up, some might have felt that was an incredibly painful silence and why did it go on so long? And that's all fine. But just hold on to your thoughts as I share what I understand as the difference between those two. So I mentioned this image of a garden. And for me, I was thinking about gardening because I like gardening. I'm a big gardener, but I thought it might be a good metaphor for describing the difference between changing behaviors and changing hearts and minds. So changing behaviors for me has to do with changing actions, how we do things, how we behave, how we act, what we say, how we interact with others. So in gardening terms, it might be how we plant a garden, what plants we put in the ground or in garden boxes, whether we weed or water or fertilize or do nothing, all those sorts of actions related to gardening. Um, Whereas changing hearts and minds has to do with changing values, what we believe in, what we hold dear, what we think is right or just or fair. So in gardening terms, that might be things like choosing to go organic or choosing to use synthetic fertilizers, choosing to plant heritage seeds or genetically modified seeds, grow for profit or give away everything to neighbors, or even the choice to value gardening at all and not just go to the grocery store. So take a moment to go back to your initial thoughts on changing behaviors and changing hearts and minds. So given this sort of distinction that I'm making, do you have any additional thoughts to add? And again, I'll pause just very briefly. Okay, so now that I've set up this sort of distinction between behaviors and hearts and minds, let's talk about how those can work within equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility contexts. And from here on, I'm going to abbreviate it EDIA just for brevity, but you can think of the whole terms as well. So to start with changing behaviors, in EDIA contexts, often this means considering, for instance, how colleagues interact with each other or with those outside of the organization. It also means thinking about particular processes or ways of doing things. For instance, how vacation time is allocated, how information is shared within or beyond an organization, how decisions are made, that sort of thing. And in terms of reasons for a change might be needed because something overtly harmful is happening, or it might be something more subtle. So you could imagine an organization or a leader saying, well, we could be doing better to be more inclusive or more equitable. So sometimes it's just about general improvement or general desire for change, but it also can be relating to something more reactive. And sometimes it also can be motivated by external factors, government laws, human rights codes, other external compliance mandates that professional organizations or governing bodies might have, or broader changes in society. So I'm going to share now a few different examples of behavior change in an EDIA setting to give you a sense of what this might, how it might show up. So the first example, I was thinking about accessibility. So accessibility usually refers to ensuring access for people with disabilities by reducing and removing barriers to their participation as much as possible. So behavior changes might include incorporating physical accessibility audits into strategic plans, could include encouraging managers to work with direct reports to better accommodate needs in the workplace, or it might include adapting documents to include alternative text, audio and video transcripts, larger fonts, other accessibility tools, that sort of thing. In Manitoba, the Accessibility for Manitobans Act, or AMA, helps motivate behavior change around accessibility and the removal of barriers. The AMA describes a variety of standards that organizations of particular sizes have to follow, and these standards have been phased in over time since the Act became law in 2013. And so, just as an example of an external factor motivating behavior change, as each of these standards have come in, there's often a lot of behavior change that happens. So for instance, one standard called the Accessible Information and Communication Standard came into effect in May of 2022. And here at the U of M, where I was at the time, again, lots of folks took new trainings, changed practices, big initiatives, but the same thing was happening all across the province as different organizations responded to that standard coming into effect. Second example that I wanted to think about was anti-racism. So we can think about behavior change in the context of race and ethnicity, but remembering that race is a social construct and that we all have unconscious biases that are learned from our communities, families, and societies, that means that it's really common for everyone to make race-related mistakes when interacting with others. And often those mistakes are unintended and come as a result of a lack of awareness. For instance, the question, where are you from, can come from a place of genuine curiosity, as a common everyday interaction, but sometimes it might be asked repeatedly of a racialized colleague, or it might be followed up with an repeated, no, but where are you really from? Particularly if the person answers with a Canadian location and is racialized. And this can turn the question into a microaggression that's rooted in racist assumptions, often unconscious, but still racist, that Canadians or Manitobans or Winnipeggers are white, and that they speak English with particular accents. So in this instance, we might think about behavior change around helping colleagues to overcome their unconscious biases or to interact with each other in ways that don't activate microaggressions, racial or otherwise. We might also consider behavior change around helping each other to do better by teaching staff how to respectfully watch out for and alert colleagues when they make a microaggression. Or we could also talk about behavior change around taking responsibility for someone's actions and the harms one might cause, even unintentionally, and encourage people to apologize when they make mistakes. So focusing on the apology piece. Of course, under this sort of topic of anti-racism, it's possible to imagine lots more problematic behavior that would need changing around overt harassment and discrimination, violations of human rights legislation, and that would need a different level of intervention, absolutely, but it would still in some sense be about a behavior change rather than changing someone's beliefs or values. And then the third sort of topic to think about here might be gender inclusivity. And again, these are just 3 examples. There's plenty more, obviously. So a general behavior change here might be working to have all staff use more inclusive language in workplace conversations and communication materials. For instance, imagine an initiative to change language to be gender neutral from only using he pronouns or maybe using he/she pronouns, but instead shift into a more neutral and inclusive they. Or there might be an initiative around pronoun use in general and the need to share personal pronouns and respect the pronouns shared by others. So those are sort of 3 examples, but there are still challenges with focusing on behavior change. And so now we're going to do a very quick poll just to illustrate some of those challenges. So we should see that appearing on your screen shortly. So there's 2 questions. Have you ever made a New Year's resolution? And have you ever broken a New Year's resolution? So put in your answer and we'll see the results shortly. All right, let's take a look at those results. So perhaps not surprisingly, a lot of you have made New Year's resolutions, and even more have broken New Year's resolutions. And so, of course, this is a quick, simple illustration of the fact that changing behaviors is very hard, and so you can't expect to change them with just one intervention, New Year's or otherwise. We need regular reminders and encouragement. We need processes, we need practices that will help to integrate the change rather than expecting people to remember to add it on. Think about hiring processes. It's a lot easier to consider accessibility needs if it's standard procedure to include questions like, do you need any accommodations with the interview process when you're talking to candidates? Or to just automatically share information about where, say, gender neutral washrooms are located. So if that's a part of the process, it's easier to remember, it's easier to do. But similarly, we also can't expect people to change behaviors after a single 2-hour workshop or hour-long webinar, for that matter. For long-term learning and change, we need regular, ongoing education, reminders, regular discussions, and an ongoing practice. So I think what's important to remember is that behavioral change can go a long way to making a workplace more equitable, diverse, inclusive, and just welcoming overall. But sometimes we need to change more than just behaviors. So perhaps the organization is taking a new strategic direction, engaging with new communities. Perhaps it's a question of motivation that would help make that behavior change easier. If people believe something matters, they could be more likely to invest the time and energy in making a behavioral change. Now, this slide has an image of a coral reef with ocean alongside it. And here I was really thinking about depth, because I think changing hearts and minds is really about that very deep change that's also important. So let's talk about that now. So changing hearts and minds often means changing what people think is important, what matters to them, what their values, beliefs, and morals include. And when we think about changing these things in individuals, it might seem a little bit out of scope of what needs to happen in a workplace setting, but it does intersect with organizations. So I talked about earlier things like strategic planning, or maybe taking a new initiative or engaging with new communities. It might also mean things like wanting to change the culture of an organization, mission, vision, value statements. So really thinking about those bigger, deeper shifts that an organization will face might lead to a need to change hearts and minds. But many of the motivations are also similar as for behavioral change. So it could be that you're reacting to a problematic situation, you're proactively wanting to improve or change, or you're responding to external factors like laws and professional standards. So all of those things might still be a motivation here as well. But if we go back to our 3 examples, the target for that change is slightly different in the hearts and minds approach. So if we return to our 3 examples from before, First, thinking about accessibility, I think one change in thinking about hearts and minds might be simply to value greater accessibility as important within the organization. To say and have all employees believe this is not just something we add on, this is something that we incorporate all the time, this is something that we uphold as part of our work. But we can also think about the different types of barriers to access that people with disabilities face. So often in accessibility, folks immediately start thinking about physical barriers, stairs instead of ramps, push buttons on doors, snow clearing, massive issue in Manitoba where we're located. But often it's actually attitudinal barriers that are the most common issues that are and these are things about people's attitudes, their behavior, their hearts and minds that impact the way that we interact with each other and the issues that people with disabilities face. So that might be misguided assumptions that people with disabilities can't do a task because of their disability, or erroneous beliefs that necessary accommodations for an individual or for a group of folks are just going to be so costly or so complicated that we shouldn't even consider it. Again, erroneous. Another common attitudinal barrier is for folks to give overwhelming praise when people with disabilities complete a simple task. Thinking back to microaggressions from earlier. So here, changing hearts and minds about people with disabilities, changing those attitudinal barriers reduces accessibility barriers overall. So in this sense, it's a really important part of any initiative in this area. Turning to the second example of anti-racism, around values and beliefs, there is so much to talk about in this area. So, and you might have noticed some of that when I was talking about anti-racism with regard to behavior change. So I talked about racism as a social construct. I talked about it as something made up by humans rather than a biological fact. I used language that emphasized how racism works systemically and subtly and isn't just about a single individual and their choices. I also shared that we can all say or do racist things even when we don't mean to. And so those are really getting at some of the beliefs, the values, the hearts and minds pieces. And you can imagine on your own some of the opposing beliefs, values that might go against some of those established beliefs or about racism and anti-racism. And I think for me, a lot of the real work of anti-racism is helping people unpack those beliefs and values and actually simply become more comfortable talking about race. Because at least in particularly white Canadian and white Manitoban society, it's considered impolite in a lot of cases. And so overcoming those beliefs and values is really important if we want to address racist behaviors, thoughts, actions, deeds. And behavior change is an important part of that, but really that deeper understanding and valuing is really critical to the change that needs to happen. Turning to the third example, gender inclusivity, what you might expect me to say now is that hearts and minds change would involve greater acceptance or understanding for gender equality and gender diverse folks and gender diversity in general. And I wish for that with all my heart, but in terms of what I want to have happen in organizations, I'm hesitant to suggest that that's the right focus. Because I'm really thinking about campaigns like the No Big Deal campaign around pronoun use. And in that campaign, it strongly emphasized the need for people to change only their behaviors by using the pronouns that other people share with them, but not needing to worry so much about changing what they perceive to be true. And I think that campaign and many others like it really emphasize that the behavior of using the correct pronouns can and should happen, even if individuals don't understand gender diversity or transgender identity or don't agree with it. All of the values and beliefs are secondary, that it's not a big deal, change the behavior and don't worry about values and beliefs. So actually kind of runs counter to my argument a little bit, which is totally fine with me. But on the other hand, I think in this gender inclusivity area, I think an important hearts and mind change is valuing difference, valuing everyone as human, regardless of their gender identity or any other social identity, and treating others with respect, including addressing them in the way they want to be addressed. So perhaps those are the values and beliefs that could be important to work on in an organization that would connect to this topic, as well as others, of course. So thinking about limitations here, one of the biggest difficulties with focusing an EDIA initiative on values and beliefs is that they are so complex and multifaceted. So that simple fact makes it very hard to design an initiative that's going to change them. We also want to be careful about telling people what to believe or what to value, not just in the workplace, but in society in general. Because after all, if we want to be true to our beliefs around what inclusion is, it's about bringing everyone into the conversation if we can, as long as they're not deliberately hurting or harming others. So being open to difference, being open to dialogue and discussion is really important. Research literature on motivation relating to EDIA topics has also spent a fair amount of time discussing whether it's helpful to focus on values and beliefs at all, and there is some advice about how to do it more or less effectively. For instance, Nicole Legate and Netta Weinstein suggest that telling people why they should value something is actually less effective than giving them the space to decide for themselves why they should value something. So if values are imposed upon people, they often get more defensive, retrench, resist, which is certainly something we're seeing a lot of these days, and perhaps something you've experienced yourself, whether as someone who's been told to believe something or as someone who's been doing the telling, or regardless of your position, just that sense of, no, I don't want to do this because you're telling me to. Sometimes having a conversation about an organization's values can help bring people into a more productive discussion than talking about individual people's values. So thinking about what is the organization value, and since we all work for this organization, let's work together to enact that, rather than you all need to value it because I told you to. And then finally, just recognizing that similar to behavior change, hearts and minds change would take a long time. And in some cases, it might never change. Sometimes it is better to keep personal beliefs and values private and to work with a surface level of actions and behaviors instead. Or as another researcher, Larissa K. Barber, puts it, to be pragmatic, to talk about a shared EDIA-related problem in the organization and strategize ways to solve it. Through those behavior-oriented conversations, you can also be building a greater valuing of EDIA-related beliefs in the background to the pragmatic work you're doing together. So that's another possibility. So this next slide has an image of a bunch of scary looking thunderclouds and a giant lightning bolt striking down onto a prairie setting to really lead us towards the discussion of how to continue to advocate and educate on these topics, given the turbulent times we're living through. And I just want to name that there's so much to worry about these days, and how you define turbulent times, whether that's resistance, pushback, outright legal challenges to equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility initiatives, economic challenges that might require restructuring or budget tightening, the climate crisis and its impact on food and housing security, as well as mental and physical health. So many other turbulent times. If I started to list them all, we'd get 5 more by dinner time. So just recognizing that this is a challenging moment. And one thing that's giving me courage these days is remembering that actually the resistance to EDIA and social justice movements that we're encountering now is not new. For me, as somebody who's only middle-aged and who's lived with so much privilege for most of my life, it does feel new, but I also want to remember that not everyone shares my identities and lived experiences, and that there are many for whom this is absolutely not new, and that resistance to social justice efforts is something some folks have faced their entire lives and for generations. So for me, I'm finding a lot of inspiration from Indigenous peoples, for instance, who've challenged colonization for centuries. I'm finding inspiration from newcomers to the territory currently known as Canada, who continue to challenge the so many frustrations of the immigration system that this country has. I'm thinking about people of African descent in both Canada and the US who've fought for emancipation, abolition, and civil rights. So these sort of historic and present day examples and many more really help me remember that resistance is not a reason to give up. It's a reason to change tactics, to renew coalitions, and rethink approaches. And the other advantage to the fact that resistance is not new is that there's some great research around resistance to initiatives, particularly around EDIA, and some strategies for addressing it. And it's really clear in the literature that whether you're focusing on behaviors or hearts and minds. What's really important is that everyone does the work and that everyone feels their contributions matter. It's important for leaders to demonstrate their commitment and to actively support EDIA efforts rather than leaving the work to just a few motivated individuals. And it's also important for people with majority identities to work in allyship with people with systemically marginalized identities. So not to leave the work exclusively to one or the other. I think it's also important, especially these days, to carefully consider how to frame initiatives in a way that invites people into the conversation rather than pushes them away. No one is a terrible person because they're not using gender inclusive language, and no one is a terrible person because they are using gender neutral language. Our actions might sometimes be pretty terrible, but I think it's important to remember that we're also humans and that we need to value that humanity when we're engaging with one another. So it's important, therefore, to seek out common values and beliefs, emphasize shared goals within your organization or within whatever group you're working with, and to frame initiatives using the values that matter to the people that you're working with. I think one thing I'm often reflecting on is to help people, to help motivate people to love working in your organization, not because it's perfect or because it's the best, but because it makes mistakes and learns and grows from them, sort of normalizing that idea that it's okay to make mistakes, but we're going to work to address them and learn and grow, and to be open to different perspectives and ideas. So we'll move from here to talking a little bit about education, because I really feel like whether you're focused on behavior change or hearts and mind change or both, I think that education has the power to change both of those things. And maybe this is not surprising given that I've essentially spent my entire life in educational institutions, whether as a student or as a faculty or as a staff, but I really do believe in the power of education to do quite a lot. But I think it's important to also be cautious and intentional with the educational approaches we take, because of course there's lots of literature cautioning that training alone is not enough to make change, whether in terms of EDI or anything else. But in fact, if poorly designed or implemented, trainings can make things worse rather than better. So educational initiatives, if they are thoughtfully designed and implemented, can provide a space for everyone in an organization to share ideas and find those common understandings of theories and practices related to equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. So here's a few just examples of what I mean by thoughtful educational approaches. So the first one is thinking about the concept of lifelong learning, but really here nuancing that to talk about the ability to value learning that people already have prior to the training and to help them grow from there rather than assuming everyone has the same common starting place. Another consideration around lifelong learning is to think about and respect that it always takes time to integrate new learning, whether into behaviors or values and beliefs. So schedule those regular follow-up sessions over the days, months, years following the training to review and deepen and to do check-ins, figure out where are we at now, what do we still need to learn, what new things have emerged that we have to address, looking for those moments to keep people motivated to engage. The third important thing to think about would be to address diverse identities and lived experiences. So we all have a range of social identities and personal identities. We all have unique lived experiences, but as well as that uniqueness, they do bring us together in different groupings. And in EDI trainings in particular, it's particularly important to balance the needs of those with majority group or privileged identities with those who are systemically marginalized because of their identities. So thinking carefully about who is this training for, who are you teaching to, and addressing that appropriately. The next one is to think about open discussions, so providing that space for exploration to help participants feel comfortable sharing what they know and to ask questions about what they don't, and provide opportunities for people to share ideas and educate each other. Some folks talk about calling that a safe space for learning and questioning, but also keep in mind that the space needs to be an accountable one where unintentional harms are addressed. So it can't be a safe space where I can deliberately or willfully make mistakes without being held to account for the impact that they have on others. And an effective facilitator can really help a group to work through any feelings around discomfort, shame, or harm in a way that's productive for everyone's learning and growth. And then the last one, which really kind of summarizes my entire aim here, is to be intentional. So designing an experience that matches your goal, knowing what your goal is in the first place. Are you trying to change behaviors? Are you trying to change hearts and minds? Doing both, doing something else entirely. How soon? What do you want to change? And then making sure that whatever education you're offering really aligns with that goal. So given my employer, it makes sense for me to talk a little bit about the University of Manitoba's efforts in this area. But, reflecting back on what I just said, I want to be clear, no one is perfect. There's a lot of work still to do at the U of M to making a truly equitable, diverse, inclusive, and accessible organization. But there are some good things happening here that I wanted to share about. So one of them, it has to do with the University of Manitoba's new strategic plan, which is called Momentum. Props to the marketing team for coming up with that title. So equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility are woven through the institution's goals. The U of M commitments to transformative change are bold and far-reaching, and I'd characterize them as emphasizing both behaviors and hearts and minds. And equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility are emphasized as core values for the institution, alongside a separate pillar around truth and reconciliation, and also named in various parts of the plan as actions or behavioral shifts and strengthening. So even within the strategic plan, you can see the behaviors and the hearts and minds and how both of those areas are woven in. Turning to the Division of Extended Education, we've also woven EDIA along with reconciliation into the divisional strategic plan. And that in some ways reflects the benefits of a top-down approach. Central leadership said, this is what matters to the institution. And then smaller units within the organization say, oh, well, we're encouraged to value the same or similar things, while still developing our own unique paths. But, and also remembering that sometimes the top-down initiative came because a smaller group said, this matters, let's make it institutional. So just recognizing that push and pull between leadership and the broader organization and the way that those two things are quite closely connected. One thing that we're doing at Extended Education that really contributes to the university's goals is our leadership in developing and delivering new EDIA programming for all U of M staff, students, and faculty. And this includes a course called EDIA 0100 Foundations, which focuses on core concepts and actions relating to equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And it also includes a 3-course micro-certificate in EDIA where learners choose their own area of focus and development and complete additional learning in specific topic areas, an action project, and a final reflective portfolio. And these courses are really unique among EDIA offerings both on our campus and in universities across Canada because they emphasize both knowledge and action and because they're designed to shift both behaviors and hearts and minds. And learners really strengthen their values, develop competencies, engage in critical self-reflection on their own actions and beliefs through all of these initiatives. Of course, we recognize these are not the only ways that behavioral and hearts and minds change is happening at the university, and these courses are really part of a larger ecosystem that's furthering that change. But in a little over a year, we've had over 300 people take the first course and over 70 start the micro-certificate. And in a recent request for feedback, learners overwhelmingly agreed they'd recommend the program to others and reported that as a result of taking these courses, they're better able to apply EDIA concepts in both their work and personal lives to contribute to positive change. And we are so, so excited to get those kinds of results after just a little more than a year. It's really exciting. And now we're also excited to be able to bring the success of that sort of learning and program design to a broader community through a new course called EDIA 0108, Understanding Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Accessibility in Practice. So with this course, we really wanted to get at both behavior change and hearts and minds change. And we emphasized knowledge and action, encouraging learners to consider scenarios and strategies for their own workplace. We develop learners' skills in critical self-reflection, encourage them to consider their own place in the world and in societal and personal change around these topics. And we meet learners where they're at and help them grow from there, whether these concepts are brand new or old news. We value lifelong learning, and we know there's always more to learn. And we really emphasize the fact that not only can people learn from the course materials and the instructor, but also from each other. So by taking this course, we anticipate learners will be able to apply what they learn in this course to their workplace so everyone can thrive, that they'll be better able to challenge unfair systems and practices to identify and remove barriers for all, that they'll be able to strengthen understanding of key terminology and concepts, because we know that, I can rattle through equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, but does everyone even know what those terms mean? Is such an important part of this conversation. And then finally, to develop important skills in critical self-reflection and empathy for different perspectives so that folks can work from a place of compassion towards justice. And we know that these goals will be met with this course because we've already seen great results around that here at the University of Manitoba. And just recognizing past participants of our training consistently report an increase in their personal self-awareness and their ability to act appropriately in matters relating to equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. So to ensure that this course would be relevant to organizations in our community here in Manitoba, we engaged in significant consultations and industry engagement with a variety of community partners. And in particular, the team at Extended Education is grateful to the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce for supporting and amplifying our efforts in both the consultation and launch of this course. The Code Coalition is an inspiring group of organizations that share many of the values and goals of Extended Education, and we expect that this course will align strongly with the goals of that initiative. And so to get into a few of the details about the course, it's 18 hours over 3 months. And this allows for a much deeper experience than many EDIA trainings to inform and inspire real change, both professionally and personally. We've designed it to be something that is possible to complete in addition to other professional and personal responsibilities. So it has a flexible learning model with a mix of at your own pace online learning, as well as 2 scheduled sessions where learners work with others in the course to discuss and apply what they've learned. And then there's a final assignment that brings everything together with a personal statement and commitments to action. And there's a QR code both on this slide and the next slide to encourage you to check out more details about the course on our website and even go ahead and register now for our next intake. And with that, I just want to thank you all for your attention today. I know for myself, it takes a lot to just focus even while someone is speaking. So I appreciate that you've been willing to be with me for this time. And I'll now turn it back over to Yvonne to moderate the questions. And I look forward to getting to respond to some of your burning thoughts.
Thank you, Robin, for the insightful discussion. We do have some questions. I'd like to thank those who submitted for doing so. And anyone else, please feel free to continue to submit questions. We'll do our best to answer them. So Robin, the first question is, what are the impacts of social exclusion on individuals and communities? Given that this is an attitudinal focus, how can we effectively promote empathy among individuals? What actionable steps can individuals take to foster inclusivity and improve future outcomes besides education?
That is a complex question. I pulled up the Q&A thing so that I can read through it a few more times. So thank you for that. And I think it's absolutely true. I think, to summarize, what are the impacts of social exclusion on individuals and communities? I think they're negative, right? No one wants to be excluded. It doesn't feel good to be left out. It doesn't, I think, though I really do turn to those emotional impacts first, but of course there's others, right? The opportunity for advancement, for finding housing, for feeling secure in your life, for being able to follow the path that you want to follow in your dreams, in your hopes, in your beliefs, having adequate basic needs met. All of those things are just some of the impacts. Um, in terms of promoting empathy, I think what I often think about is the inviting folks to take that time to imagine what it would be like to be somebody besides yourself. And that is such a hard thing for so many of us. I think, maybe that's just a human limitation, is this sense. So you're always stuck in who you are and your own experiences, and trying to get outside of that is really challenging. And certainly in the course that we're talking a little bit about today, there are those opportunities to listen to perspectives different from your own, listen to folks who have different lived experiences. And I think that's really a part of it for me, is that and I think when I'm, to get to the last part of the question about what else can we do besides education, I think often it's that interacting with others really important piece. So, recognizing and looking for perspectives that are different from your own, whether that's through movies or books or other media, whether it's through engaging in activities in the community where you have that chance to interact with different folks who are different from you in different ways. I think that's a really important, like, individual action that anyone can take at any time. There's so many events, community happening in every community, just that. And I think especially coming out of the pandemic, we're still in this phase of like, no, we're going to just stay with the people we know, but we have to push ourselves to get back into those spaces where we encounter difference and where we navigate it and where we learn about experiences other than our own. So, wonderful question. So much that I could keep talking about, but maybe I'll stop there to see if there's other important questions.
Thanks, Robin. So there's a question related to diversity and inclusion. The question is, being in a healthcare organization makes transparency daunting. How transparent should we be? How can a company manage it? I am not sure if she's not sure if she's asking the question in the right context, but I'm sure you get what she means here.
Yeah, I think this person's
Sorry.
question is it's really important, right? Like, I think for myself, having transparency is so important, and hearing from leadership, this is what's going on and this is what we can share, and this is why we're making the decision we're making. But of course, you're right. A healthcare organization is a great example of one where you can't be 100% transparent about here's all the details of why we're making this decision. But of course, other professions have, privacy laws. We're in an institutional educational setting where we have privacy around what we can disclose around students, for instance, and their information. So there's all those sorts of impacts. And I think the, great leadership for me is about saying, this is what I know is the full picture, but how much of that can I reasonably share with the people I'm working with so that they understand and so that they feel that sense of transparency, even if it's not every last detail. And I think, being a thoughtful leader who can find that balance is, yes, daunting to use your words, but I think is really important, right? In terms of building trust in the organization, getting that buy-in from people that, yes, this is the right initiative, or I understand why that decision was made, is really important. So I think, the balance will be different for every organization and every individual, but striving, I think, for more transparency as I able, to me, it's kind of where I would land.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So we also have another question. Is there a specific timeline for an individual to accept diversity and inclusivity? Or is it necessary for them to accept it simply because they are employed by an organization? In addition to this, does this indicate a suppression of their true feelings or behaviors?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I really appreciate that. I think, but I think answering it would maybe depend on the specific context. So, and you know what's at play. So, in terms of accepting diversity and inclusivity, in some ways, maybe there's no required timeline, you know, especially around the values or hearts and minds piece. That's up to you as an individual. And but at the same time, thinking about some external factors like laws, like, you know, government things like policies at an organization that impact on behaviors, there might well be a more strict timeline in terms of, you know, this is, you know, something that everybody is supposed to do because it's required by law, or the behavior this person is engaging in is discriminatory or harassing, or maybe not as seriously breaking the law, but still has some problems in it that we need to address as soon as possible. So I think there is that sense of, you know, the timeline depending a little bit on the nature of the behavior or the change that you're asking for. I think often, you know, setting aside those more problematic things, I think that it can take as long as it needs to take. I think often when I've thought about, you know, how these initiatives are rolling out, there's often people who are impatient and then people who are taking more time because it's new to them. And I think, you know, one thing to consider if you're in a leadership role or you're involved in rolling things out is to really you know, being able to manage people's expectations, to help those folks who are like, we needed to do this 10 years ago. Why are we still talking about it? Helping them to see that, yes, this conversation is important, even though it feels like it's going too slow. Helping the people who are just like, oh, I'm not, can we just talk about this for 2 more years? Because I'm just not really like, no, we need to do something sooner than that. So yeah, there's a lot of delicate conversations around how to make it happen. I think, you know, sort of to bring in reconciliation for a little bit, I've certainly been involved in conversations in that related but distinct initiative. And you know, sometimes it takes time, and you need to take the time to build a solid foundation to get people to understand why this matters for your organization or what's important. And so that time is important. But then to be able to recognize, you know what, we're going in circles here and it's not helping us, and we need to move forward. So yeah, I think, you know, again, just being really mindful of what's happening, being able to kind of see the bigger picture, and move things along as needed would be really important too.
Okay, so we have another question. It's a short one. How do you respond to the reversed discrimination comment?
I think often and you know, it's a tough one, but I think often what people will talk about, and something I myself has used, is to talk about the difference between individual acts and systemic. Because, so for instance, when talking about racism and reverse racism, um, at a systems level, to have any system of oppression, you need power. And so if we're talking about systemic racism, there is, you know, a particular skin tone that comes with automatic power and privilege in this society, and that's the white or pale skin tone. And so recognizing that that is impacting on anything, reverse discrimination is less of it. You can't talk about it in the same way as, because the power is not there. Certainly you can talk about, you know, and I think it's sort of a complicated question because the way that it shows up is different depending on the situation. But recognizing as well, so for instance, you know, to use a different example, that's getting a lot of currency right now around sort of the notion of merit in hiring. And while we have to go back to a merit-based system, we need to recognize, because it's not fair if we have particular groups receiving preferential treatment. Well, the reality is that we've never had a merit-based system. We've always had a particular group receiving preferential treatment, but they didn't know it because they were in the position of power and privilege. and everyone else knew it because they weren't getting the same things. And so I think often it for me, it becomes a really complicated conversation, as you can hear. Can you imagine talking to your neighbor and just the way that I described for the last 5 minutes? No. But I think it gets back to that sense too, that hearts and minds take a long time to uncover. And so you have to be ready, to have the quick, snappy answer of, there's more to it than that, but also be ready to educate yourself and then talk to others about, well, let's think about this a little bit more detail. So I hope that helps. Yeah, that's, maybe I'll just pause there, just given the amount of time we have.
Yeah, so we'll see how much, we have 6 more minutes, so I will see what I can do in terms of a question. So some countries have implemented empathy classes within elementary education systems and have noticed a significant drop in bullying. I thought this was fantastic. Do you happen to know if there are any empathy curriculum in the works for schools and other workplaces?
That's not something I'm fully aware of. My focus in education has been more on post-secondary education, so I'm less familiar with what happens in the kindergarten to grade 12 context. But I mean, it sounds amazing, and I think the more that people can learn about other people's perspectives and empathizing with them from a young age, the better. So, I'm really excited to hear about that. Thank you.
So last question before we close out the session. So I will rephrase this sentence slightly. So what about if the individuals, who are, behaving in a way that's not appealing to you is actually someone that you work for, like a supervisor, that sort of thing? How do you deal with that? I think I'll leave it at that in terms of the question.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's really important. And actually, I noticed another person has just shared that there's a program called Roots of Empathy, if I can go back to the previous question. So thank you, person who shared that, just as an example. But to get to this question about, what to do when you've got some of those power dynamics at play is really a challenge, right? And I think a lot of what I've been talking about has assumed that you're in an organization where there's a desire to do this. And I think if for those of you who are here, if you are in a place where you're not, I'm sorry. And I hope that you can find those supports, whether that's colleagues or friends outside of the organization, family, looking for those supports beyond the workplace, really important. And I think also, particularly in larger organizations, looking for colleagues in other areas. So if your organization is large and has many different units, maybe you can find somebody in a different unit or a group of people. Find those connections. Here at the University of Manitoba, now that we've got this growing group of people who've taken courses, that's a whole community to rely on. So reaching out to those connections, finding folks to get advice on those specific issues, I think is really important, because it's true, no matter how much a certain group of people can say like, yes, we're doing to change behaviors, we are going to change hearts and minds. Sometimes if at a higher level, the answer is no, we're not. Then you're a little bit stuck. And I think there it becomes important to build those coalitions, find those movements for change, advocate, with higher ups if need be, to really make those changes happen.
Okay, so I think we're looking, sorry, I'm just gonna check here. I'm having a little trouble keeping up with some of the questions.
Lots of passion from folks today, which is
I
fantastic.
know. I think there was a question related to the next session and how the instruction of that next session and who would be the instructor.
Right. And I believe for a lot of the questions specific to the course, we are going to be sending out more materials afterwards. So For those kind of course logistics questions, feel free to continue to ask them and we will be in touch. And there's also contact information on the website if you have more questions relating to the course specifically.
Wonderful, thank you. So we're at time now. Thank you very much, Robin, for answering all of the questions. Some of them were, as you said, a lot more complicated and a little bit more difficult to answer in a short time frame. You did an outstanding job. I sure everyone appreciates the effort you put in. So on behalf of the Division of Extended Education at the University of Manitoba, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today.